Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 4. And I apologize for getting this lecture put up a little bit late in the day. I had a lot going on, but here is lecture 6, or the first half of it at least. Last week, we only had one lecture, and we got into plate tectonics and some other intro geology, and I also went over a little bit of the modern geology of Antarctica, what types of plate boundaries you find in Antarctica today. Today, I will be first doing a brief overview of fossils and of the rock record in general, and then we'll start at the very beginning as much as we can with the geologic and paleontological history of Antarctica, kind of talking about worldwide changes in the Earth's configuration and in terms of the life that lived on Earth at the same time. One unfortunate aspect is that because Antarctica has so little rock cover, it can be hard to find fossils there, but we have found some quite interesting material there, and I hope you find this as fascinating as I do. So a quick reminder that the midterm is coming up. It will be available this coming Monday, February 1st, and I will be posting a study guide later this week. And the midterm will be open until Sunday, February 7th. The lecture on Wednesday, February 3rd will be devoted to exam review, and I will also be hosting a review session during my office hours on Monday, February 1st, that is. Looking ahead, the week after the midterm, reading assignment number 1 is due. This week, as you're going through this lecture and the next one, there are a couple of paleontology articles listed under Gaucho Space, so I'd like you to read those. And there's also an episode of Walking with Dinosaurs. It's about 30 minutes, and I'd like you to watch the whole thing if you can. It's honestly pretty fun. It's honestly one of my favorite TV programs, but that's just me. Here again is the format for assignment 1 in case you need a reminder of that. It's a writing assignment about a news article. If you can't find it on Gaucho Space, look under week 6 because that's when it's due. I don't really like how Gaucho Space kind of makes it hard to make this assignment visible elsewhere. I guess I can copy it, but it is visible under week 6 and also under assignments if you go there. And ignore this. I will fix this in the version that I put online. It's not due in April. It's due in February. This was copied from previous incidents of the class. But everything else is basically the same. It's about you're writing about a news article about science. So I recommend getting a head start on that. It's not due until after the midterm, but it's a way to get some work taken care of if you'd like. So the first half of the lecture, aka this video, we're mostly going to go over the rock record and fossils, and then we'll talk more about Antarctica. The second video for this lecture, the second half of the lecture will go from the very earliest rocks of Antarctica until right before the dinosaurs show up. So we'll start with Antarctic dinosaurs next class. So time as we understand it today in terms of hours, days, and centuries extends a lot past human knowledge, far back beyond when humans have existed. We know that the Earth is billions of years old, and we can put human history on the same timeline as that. We are just only occupying the very, very tail end of it. If you look closely where my cursor is, you can see a plane at the very end of this coil. And I like this coil because it, compared to some other diagrams, it does a really nice job of showing that there's just a relatively small amount of time that we really have a great understanding of. And you see there's all these coils going back and back and back to what's supposed to be the Big Bang, where there was no life on Earth, or no Earth to begin with. The universe is older than the Earth. And our understanding of deep time, and you see that these are all fossils, and you see that there are fewer and fewer fossils as we go back. And that's not a coincidence. As we'll discover, we know very little about ancient life because there's very few remnants of that ancient life left, aka fossils. This timescale is actually defined by rocks and fossils, not the other way around. We've come up with intervals of time the same way that in history we've defined periods by, say, when the Roman Empire was around, or the Showa era of Japanese history, or the era of good feelings in US history. Just as historians will assign number years to those, the era of good feeling was, I don't know, 1820 to 1830 or something. I might be totally off, but we assign periods and eons and other intervals of geologic time to usually millions of years ago, such as when we say, oh, the Cretaceous period ended 65 million years ago. Why do we do that? That's when the dinosaurs went extinct. When a lot of creatures go extinct is often when we define the end of a period or end of a geologic interval of time. You don't need to memorize all of these, but these are just the different units of geologic time sort of stacked from broadest to smallest. We can start with eons, break eons into eras, break eras into periods like the Cretaceous, Jurassic, and Triassic periods, which are all inside of the Mesozoic era, aka the age of dinosaurs. And we can actually divide periods into further divisions if we have a good enough rock record, which is what we've done with more recent eras, recent periods. So you see that above tertiary and quaternary periods here, there are various epochs, and we are living in one such epoch, the Holocene epoch. Some people argue that we might be entering a new one, the Anthropocene, but I'm not really going to get into that for this lecture. So I say this is all defined by rocks, so let's talk a little bit about rocks. If you've taken geology, this will seem familiar, but if not, well, there's basically three types of rock. Igneous rocks are rocks formed from magma, and really all rock is igneous to begin with. The igneous rock includes the ocean rocks that are formed at spreading centers. Those were formed from a volcano. Another example would include granite, which is interesting because it doesn't actually erupt. Granite forms as it cools underground. But if the same magma that makes granite erupts at the surface, you get rhyolite, you get ash. The rock formed by the ash falling from eruptions like Mount St. Helens is an igneous rock, and so is obsidian, volcanic glass. And igneous rocks make up a lot of the Earth because when new crust is formed, either continental or oceanic, it's going to be igneous. And igneous rocks are useful to us in that we can actually obtain an absolute date from them, and we can assign a year to them, aka 14 million years ago, give or take 0.5 million years, or 13 or 500 million years ago, give or take 50 million years. And something that scientists will always tell you is that there's going to be an error. There's going to be an error involved. You have to calculate. You can't just say, oh, this is 50 million years old. You also have to say, this is 50 million years old within give or take 1 or 2 million years. But you can't really find fossils in igneous rocks. They're just too hot. If an animal falls into lava, the bones are going to melt. The only real exception to this is that sometimes ash will preserve animals or people the same way that those poor people who were buried by Mount Vesuvius at Pompeii, their skeletons were preserved. Now, sedimentary rocks are where, and actually, in this picture is of a volcanic cone in Iceland, and that's an igneous rock. This is where magma came up. When the magma solidified to rock, it formed the spatter cone. This is Goleta Slough, and that's a place where you find sediments and where, given enough time, sedimentary rocks will form. Santa Barbara County is chock full of sedimentary rocks. And sedimentary rocks form from compression of sediment. Now, when rocks, including igneous rocks, get broken down into sediment, that sediment will eventually turn into another type of rock given enough pressure. So you have sandstone formed from pieces of sand, limestone formed from chemicals weathered from igneous rocks, or shale weathered from mud. And it's really hard to obtain an absolute date on these rocks because they all come from so many different sources, and you can't get just one date from them. If you have a bunch of broken up bits of rock, it's really hard to tell where every single one of them came from. But they often have fossils in them because it turns out dinosaurs and other extinct organisms, their remnants often end up in mud or sand or ocean ooze. And as long as they get buried fast enough, that's a great way to preserve animals. Now, if the rocks get transformed by heat and pressure, we get metamorphic rocks. Metamorphic rocks include pretty ones like this skarn, and metamorphic rocks often have banding. They often look kind of warped, like they've been put through a taffy puller, and that's the heat and pressure being involved. You also have gneiss and schist or quartzite. It's often hard to date them because their minerals have been so warped, but they can be very valuable. However, it's very unlikely that you're going to find fossils in them because the same heat and pressure that cause the minerals to be warped and to form new minerals tends to destroy the fossils. So we essentially use sedimentary rocks and the fossils in them to construct the geologic timescale, and then we use igneous rocks and sometimes metamorphic rocks to put absolute dates. One thing I'll say is that with the oldest rocks, many of them are metamorphosed because they've been buried under deep heat and pressure for so long. So a lot of our oldest rocks are metamorphosed and thus a lot harder to interpret. But let's talk about how we use this for fossils. So this picture is actually from a park that I've worked at, John Day Fossil Beds National Monument, and it's famous for its great record of mammal fossils. And this picture is a good example of how one uses two separate methods of dating together. Absolute dates, like I mentioned, come from igneous rocks. Certain minerals found in some igneous rocks can be chemically analyzed for uranium and lead content, and you can measure how much the uranium has decayed to lead using a mass spec, which I'll talk about in a few slides. And using the known, and because we know basically how fast uranium decays to lead, we can do a calculation and come up with a number. There's a lot of caveats to this, but that's the basic gist of it. We use radioactivity. This works for igneous rocks, not so well for sedimentary rocks, but if we have a lava flow, a fall of ash, or an intrusive lava, like a dike is what they call them if you have lava just jutting into other things, we can analyze them and get a number. So in this case, they were able to analyze this ash fall from a big Mount St. Helens type eruption and come up with the number of 35 million years. Meanwhile, this lava flow up here is dated at 32 million years. And we'll talk about this, but logically, what is in between these two has to be age-wise also in between these two. It doesn't make sense that you'd have ash fall happen after all of this. The ash happened and then sediments fall on top of it, and then you get lava going over everything. So the cool thing about this is that even though we can't get an absolute date on the rocks in here, on the sediments in here, we can use something called absolute dating. We know that this layer is older and this layer is younger, and in this particular case, we're lucky to have dates on them. So we can say roughly that these sediments must have been laid down between 35 million years ago and 32 million years ago. So relative dating is when we use the laws of stratigraphy to determine age relations to the rocks. We basically compare the rocks to each other rather than radioactivity. We look at how they're stacked, look for erosion, look for disturbance, and stratigraphy is doing all of this. Stratigraphy is using laws and logic to piece together where the rocks were deposited, what came first, what happened when, and it's quite important for fossil hunting. And something I'll mention is that we don't often have nice situations like this. John Day Fossil Beds was actually specifically set aside because they have so many igneous layers to help date these mammal fossils, and they have such a great idea of when the mammals are from as a result of that. But usually there's a lot more guesswork involved. So this is basically how absolute dating works. We assume that the minerals crystallize when the magma cools. That magma has uranium in it. The uranium will get trapped. Then not enough uranium to cause a nuclear explosion or anything, but enough uranium to be noticeable. Some uranium will end up in these minerals, and we kind of assume that once these crystals accumulate, that they're not going to be chemically affected by much anymore. Now, if they get metamorphosed, that's a whole nother story. But once the crystals cool, the idea is that chemically they don't change very much. Kind of like how when dealing with the mid-ocean ridge, how I talked about how the little magnetic iron flecks would face in different directions depending on whether you had normal magnetic polarity or reversed. It would stay that way once the rock was cooled, kind of like this. This is kind of the same deal. You have to assume the minerals cooled quickly and at the same time as the rest of the rock, and that can be tricky. Now, at UCSB, we actually have quite a few facilities set up for obtaining these minerals. So actually this particular mineral, zircon, is the one I worked with for my Antarctic rocks. And what you need is a mineral that's durable. This mineral holds up very well to erosion. You need one that's going to incorporate the parent isotope, aka the radioactive isotope, but will hopefully not take up too much of the decay product, in this case lead. And you need a lot of crystals. So what happens is that after this crystal was formed, the uranium decays to lead, and we can look at how much uranium there is versus how much lead to figure out how old it is, but we have to isolate them first. So when I was doing mineral separation, my work involved crushing the rocks and sieving them to separate these minerals from everything else, putting them through a gold pan table, which is used to shake and separate them. It's kind of funny to me that we use it, and the reason they use gold tables is because gold is relatively heavy and it stays in place, and a lot of the sediments, which are going to be made of quartz, tend to get shaken off. Zircon is really heavy, and zircon tends to stay in place, whereas the other minerals get shaken off. After all of this fun stuff, we get to separate the minerals magnetically, use some really nasty chemicals to separate the zircons, and then pick the last bits of crap away from them by hand, so that by the time that we actually get to this point, we have a sample that is nothing but zircons or whatever mineral we're interested in. And we have this at UCSB. You don't need to memorize this, but if you think this is interesting, I'm very happy to talk more about this, because UCSB does quite a bit of cool geochronology research, aka studying the age of rocks and of associated geologic features. So what does this do? A laser is shot at the sample, and the sample is volatilized. It becomes an ionized gas, essentially a plasma. And the different elements inside of the crystal can still be read. Like you have atoms of uranium and lead that are vaporized, essentially, but they're still recognizable as uranium and lead, and they get taken up by this mass spectrometer, which can actually, it's sensitive enough to basically count how many uranium atoms are hitting it versus how many lead atoms, or if you're interested in other stuff, rubidium, strontium, but in this case, we're just interested in uranium versus lead. And then we can come up with numbers, run them through some web, crunch the numbers, and come up with dates. And the point is not to scare you or make you memorize a long list of mineral separation steps. I put this in here because it's to point out that while absolute dates might seem better and easier, they're a lot harder to come by. They're expensive because you have to put a lot of time into running these machines, and not every rock can be dated easily. Not even every igneous rock. Quite honestly, a lot of igneous rocks don't have that much zircon, or you have to deal with other minerals that are not quite as easy to work with, or whatever. So in short, absolute dating can be really difficult. So we need relative dating and stratigraphy. For relative dating, we actually use a couple of pretty simple rules. The first is that we assume that sediment is going to be sand, mud, pebbles, gravel, even boulders, but they're carried by air or water, usually water, and they flow downhill and settle where it's flat. So we're going to assume that when these sediments were deposited, they had to stop somewhere where it was flat. If they've since been warped or turned upside down, or if you have layers that are just like this, like just basically vertical, because that does happen, that doesn't mean that they weren't deposited horizontally. That means that after they were lithified, turned into rock, some tectonic force like an earthquake or something distorted them. And that's something, if you're familiar with the hills around Santa Barbara, that's something you see a lot here. We have former flat layers of sediment that have been warped into these curvy shapes. The second rule is superposition, which is my favorite rule, in that it's just so simple. It's whatever is on the bottom is older, whatever is on top is younger, because it doesn't make sense for a layer of sediment it doesn't make sense for someone to like lift up the rocks, put a layer of sediment, and then put it back. That's funny in a cartoon, but it doesn't really make sense. Another one is lateral continuity, and that means that the sedimentary layers were once continuous, and that if there's any gaps between them, that was eroded later. And what I mean by that is, if you have something like the Grand Canyon, which is a fantastic example, because on either side of the Grand Canyon, you can see the same stripy sequence of rocks. Even if you don't know what all the rocks are, you can recognize that. And those rocks were all originally, each one was a single continuous layer. What caused them to be separated? The Colorado River. And the Colorado River cut the Grand Canyon much more recently than most of those rocks were deposited. Some of those rocks in the Grand Canyon are billions of years old, whereas the Colorado River is a couple tens of millions of years old, if I remember correctly. Monument Valley is another really good example of that. finally, if you have a feature that cuts across another feature, so actually a canyon is a version of that. The canyon cuts across the features, and so it came after. But you also have cases where rocks cut across layers of other rocks, and the feature that is cutting across is the younger feature. To give you an example, this is actually a dike or an intrusion of igneous rock from my field research. So you actually have 3 layers of rock here. You have the black dikes, the pink dikes, and then this gray rock in the background. Fun fact, you could actually, they're all igneous, so you could actually get absolute dates from all of them, but if you couldn't, you can still make an educated guess as to what came first. Usually sort of the background rock, what they call the country rock, is going to be there first. And this granite was indeed here first because both the black and the pink dikes cut across it. Something that might be a bit hard to see is that the pink dike actually disrupts the black dikes. You can see how one of the black dikes just stops here. And if something just stops, it's cut off by something else, that means that something else came there later. Another good example of that is, say, if a layer is just cut off from erosion. But it doesn't really make sense, but it really doesn't make sense for rocks to it doesn't make sense for the granite, the gray rock, to just have filled in the space around this. That's absurd. The gray rock was here first, and then these other smaller dikes intruded afterwards. And these black dikes were in fact the Lampreyfiers that I was looking at for my research. This is actually, I'm not going to have you do this, but this is a way to practice stratigraphy if you want to try to test yourself on what came first. And I'm very happy to go over this example with you later if you'd like to test that out on me. But what this shows is different units of rocks, different types of rocks. And you can see how some of the laws work here. You can see that a bunch of these layers were originally continuously horizontal, but there was a canyon, a river that cut through them since. This is basically what happened with the Grand Canyon. And you can see they've put symbols on here to make it really obvious that this is the same rock as this. The Haptonolite formation is, the Hamlinville formation is on the left of the gully. It's also on the right of the gully. The gully must have come afterwards. You can also see that this granite was intruded before the Larsenite formation, the Larsenton formation was deposited. Do you see how the Larsenton formation just kind of cuts the granite off? What this means is that there was erosion, the rocks were broken down after the granite was deposited, and then more sediments were deposited over it. Something interesting you can see is that this dike, this igneous dike, cuts across the granite and the Lamonton formation, the Larsenton formation, excuse me, but not the Foster City formation. And so you can make some points there. You can say, okay, we know that this dike is younger than the Larsenton formation because it cuts across it, but the Foster City formation must be younger than the Larsenton formation, or must be younger than this dike, this dike is older than the Foster City formation because this dike does not cut across the Foster City formation. This is what I mean by cutting across. You normally have flat layers, but you get features like blobs of igneous rock or dikes of igneous rock. Magma just kind of goes where it wants, honestly. Magma doesn't form nice layers. Sometimes it does, sometimes you get lava flows, but a lot of the time it just kind of goes where it wants. But the cool thing here is that this dike, it's igneous, you can get a date on it. So you can figure out how old this dike is, and then say if this dike is 25 million years old, you can then say, okay, the Foster City formation must have been deposited at a time point younger than 25 million years old. So the Larsenton formation we'd be in an even better shape for, because if we had dates on the granite and the dike, well, if we know the granite is, say, 45 million years old and the dike is 25 million years old, then that gives us a sense of when the Larsenton must have been deposited. Anyway, you get the picture. We're not going to linger on this for too long, but this is what paleontologists do. Because paleontologists are looking for fossils in the layers of rock, and they have to look at the context. They have to look at where the fossils are and what kind of environment they were in. So a fossil, the funny thing actually though, is that fossils are often how we determine like what a rock is, in the sense of there are specifically named rock units often, and those will often be named because we know that they're a certain age because we found fossils in them. And paleontology is studying the fossils and the rocks in them in regards to how they relate to modern life. A big goal of paleontology is to try to reconstruct how we got here in terms of the current biodiversity we have today, or recently lost biodiversity in terms of the, say, the animals that went extinct in the last ice age. We have a more paleontology heavy course, actually Earth 7, and I highly recommend that if you find this stuff fascinating. But a fossil, the cool thing about fossils is that they were often alive for only a short period of time. So we can find sandstone everywhere, for example, but a fossil can tell us that one sandstone is different from another sandstone. And that's what I mean by rock units. We can also look at the evolution of animals or plants that evolve quickly, like tree species or clams, um, and see how they've changed over time. Not evolve quickly. Sorry, we can especially with common fossils like clams or leaves, we can trace how they have changed over time by looking at their presence in the rock record. And let's talk about fossils, because fossils are cool, and that's how we get here. A fossil is any evidence that of an organism that used to be alive but no longer is. And it does not have to be the organism itself, actually. The key thing about fossils is that the harder parts are going to survive better. Bones, teeth, shells, exoskeletons, wood. Actually, talking about plant fossils, wood has a much bigger chance of surviving than leaves. So most fossils are that. And actually, teeth is a big thing because teeth tend to be preserved better than bones because they're smaller and less. Well, teeth are bones, but they tend to be preserved better than full skeletons because they get jumbled up and broken up less. And so for mammal and dinosaur fossils, we often look for teeth because that helps us, because teeth change a lot and are very, if you look closely, you can identify species by them, and so they're very useful. But we don't just, it doesn't have to just be a part of the creature, part of the organism's body. It also doesn't even have to be a bone. It can be an impression. It can be a footprint, or when a leaf impression is visible in mud, or we can have structures like burrows, nests, or this stromatolite, which is something I'll talk more about in this lecture. And impressions are often the only way we know about animals that don't have hard parts, or how we can see the anatomy of, say, the soft parts of a clam or something where we would normally just have the shell. We don't get those as often. We usually have to have exceptional preservation conditions to have much in the way of fossil impressions. The key thing is that fossils aren't common, and fossils represent a really tiny percentage of the actual full diversity of life that has existed on this Earth. So we thus know a very small percentage of the life that's actually existed in the past. We struggle particularly with groups of organisms that don't really have hard parts. Earthworms are really important, but we know very little about their evolution because they don't fossilize well. Same with fungi. Fungi are kind of a big mystery to us because mushroom fossils are hard to come by. They're often microscopic also. Again, hard parts like bones or shells have the best chance of being preserved. And even the hard parts of an organism may completely decay. Bones can be completely decayed before bones can be completely eaten before they, usually what happens is they get remineralized into a more durable mineral than the calcium phosphate that makes up our bones, and the exact shape is preserved. But that's another story. Even setting that aside, a skeleton can be disturbed by landslides or other animals, erosion, or, as I mentioned before, metamorphic rocks, if they form, can destroy any evidence of fossils. So if we are lucky enough to find a fossil, we will find the organism in a sedimentary rock that was formed by sediments in whatever environment that animal died. So if the animal lived in the ocean, or if an organism lived in the ocean, its remnants will end up in ocean sediment, and that will then become a sedimentary rock, and we can find the fossils, as we do actually with foraminifera fossils and limestone and coral and other stuff made of limestone. Or potentially, or in this example, you have a triceratops dying in the mud by a river, and the river mud is what ends up covering it and preserving it eventually. And this, as you see, this doesn't usually give us a complete skeleton. The process of reworking by water and burial usually causes skeletons to be disturbed. I am going to jump back just one slide. A cool thing about this dinosaur here, a lot of the time when you find full skeletons, the reason their heads are back is because the best preserved specimens often come from rapid burial by floods. and that's a position they end up in when they die. But you don't normally get full preserved skeletons like that. They usually get jumbled up really badly. So we normally don't have complete skeletons to work with. We just have scattered fossils and the rocks they were formed in to tell us the fossil record. So our library of fossils is the fossil record, essentially, and it's very incomplete. It's more complete in some sections than others. For example, one could say the fossil record of amphibians is poor, because often it is, or the fossil record of amphibians in the Cretaceous period is poor, because it might be. But the point is that the fossils that we have are a small percentage of all of the fossils that we've ever had, or the potential fossils that could have formed. And as we go back in time, the fossil record gets worse. The oldest rocks erode away, or they get turned into metamorphic rocks. Or if animals or plants don't easily preserve, if they have mostly soft parts, we don't have a lot of fossils of them. So there is definitely a sampling bias with fossils also. We have a much better record of vertebrates, of animals with skeletons, than we really do of most invertebrates, outside of clams and some other hard-shelled organisms, because vertebrates have bones and those preserve better. One thing that will come up in lab is the difference between a body fossil and a trace fossil. I mentioned before that a fossil doesn't actually have to be of the creature or organism itself. If it is, it's a body fossil. A body fossil is a bone, in this case, an impression of a tree leaf. And yes, this is a body fossil because this leaf was part of the plant. Even though it's an impression, this is actually preserving the organism itself and not something the organism did. So yes, leaf impressions are body fossils because they are of the leaf itself. Teeth are body fossils, shells are body fossils. A trace fossil is if you have evidence that an organism was there, but you can't see the organism itself anymore. I kind of think of it as like, oh, it didn't die. Maybe we have the burrow or the footprints left, but the organism didn't die. I mean, it died eventually, but the fossil is not of its untimely death, but you know what I mean. And examples of trace fossils include burrows and dens and footprints and stromatolites. And really do be careful with the leaves, because I guarantee you that will show up in the fossils lab in a couple of weeks. And you really do need to just get it into your head that if you are looking at a plant or animal itself, like if you can say this is part of an animal or this is part of a plant, it's a body fossil. Plants losing leaves is kind of like shark losing teeth. We still consider shark teeth a body fossil because it's from the body of the shark. And we still consider a leaf a body fossil because it's from the body of the tree. Now, actual trace fossils are stuff like this. This is fossilized poop. That is called a coprolite, actually. But we also have footprints, stromatolites, like I mentioned before. And by the way, actually, poop is very useful because if we can figure out what type of animal it belonged to, we can figure out what that animal ate, and make other guesses about its internal anatomy. And these are all cases where we can know the animal was doing something, walking, building burrows, pooping, but we don't have the organism itself. With both body and trace fossils, we can use their presence to help determine what kind of environment the animal lived in, and also where the rocks were formed. One thing is that we sometimes find, occasionally we find the same type of sedimentary rock in different places. Like you find mud in the ocean and you find mud in a lake, and those both produce really similar rocks. The fossils are actually one way that we can tell them apart, because if we find fossils that are clearly marine clams, like they wouldn't have survived in freshwater, and mud, that we can say, oh, this is ocean mud, not lake mud. The same way that if we find redwood leaves in mud, we can say, okay, this is very likely mud that was in a river or a lake, not out in the ocean, not out deep in the ocean, because there's land plants dropping leaves into it. And we often use fossils as index fossils to indicate what type of environment we're in, especially if we have a record of environments shifting back and forth over years. What do I mean by that? Sea level changes will do that. Sea level changes will turn beaches into offshore marine and offshore marine into deep shore marine, etc. Something we don't really have time to go over much in this class. But the thing you have to be careful about is that we have to be confident in our guess as to where these animals lived. AKA, if we're looking at a clam and a fossil, are we confident that we know this is a clam that would have lived in the ocean? Occasionally that's up for debate. Anyhow, that's my general summary of fossils in depositional environments. Up next, we'll get into the Earth history of Antarctica. That's the second half of this lecture.